In the last episode, we talked about building the forms and the shoes for a side bending machine. Now in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the other essential items that you will need in order to use a side bender. First of all, you need a thermal blanket that's at least as wide and as long as your sides. This blanket is 6 inches by 36 inches, which is plenty for the length and width of my sides. Any luthier supplier that sells these will sell them in a width and length that's appropriate for bending guitar sides. So you shouldn't have to worry about that too much. My blanket is from a company called Protherm. Here's the model number. I can't remember exactly where I ordered this from. It was probably LMI or Blues Creek Guitars, but you could probably just look up Protherm and see if it makes more sense for you to just order it directly from them. Next, we need something to regulate the blanket's temperature. As you can see, there's no adjustment dials. There isn't even an on-off switch on this. This is just a plug. If I were to just plug this in right now, it would continuously feed energy into the heating element, and this would get way hotter than we need it to be. I'm pretty sure it would eventually burn out the heating element too, but I don't know, I've never tried that. So you need something to control the amps. I picked this up from Blues Creek Guitars. John Hall is only about 45 minutes away from me. This works great. Apparently this thing was intended to regulate the power of a router, but as with many things in lutherie, it's been repurposed for something else. Now this isn't just a set it and forget it kind of thing. There's no settings for temperature on here because something like this isn't designed to hold the blanket at a certain temperature. Rather, it limits the amount of power that goes into the blanket, and how that corresponds to temperature isn't always predictable. If it was, I would just have a mark on here somewhere for the temperature setting that I want, and I would always just simply set the dial to that mark. Sometimes to maintain the same temperature, I might have the dial set here, or I might have it set all the way over here. It just varies. Which is why you need something to monitor the temperature right at the source. I use these Accurite digital meat thermometers. I use 2 of them. If you want to use even more than 2, that's even better. If you have 3 or 4 of them, because the blanket does not hold a perfectly consistent temperature across its entire length. It has wandering hot and cold spots here and there, which is why being able to monitor the temperature directly at the source is so important. So ultimately, when we go to bend this, the blanket, along with the sides and the rest of the sandwich, which we'll get into what that means in a little bit, all of that will be pressed against the form here, and these thermometers, I typically like to keep them right at either side of the waist there because that bend is so important. And like I mentioned before, it doesn't hurt to have an extra thermometer, so you can keep these 2 right here sort of near the middle, and then use another thermometer just to probe around in other areas to make sure that your blanket is hot enough to be able to make that bend in a given area. By the way, there are more sophisticated controllers out there that you can actually set a temperature on. However, because of those wandering hot and cold spots that we just talked about in the blanket, those types of controllers are limited in the accuracy that they can set on the temperature anyway. So regardless, you're going to want to monitor the temperature directly with something like this and adjust as you go in order to keep these thermometers on point. Because this right here is your true temperature. So the way that I see it, you might as well just use something like this rather than investing in something like the LMI controller when the ability to set the temperature is very limited anyway. Next, you need metal slats like these. I mentioned we'd be making a sandwich here. Well, these slats are the bread of the sandwich. These are spring steel, so when you bend them, they always return back to shape. And these are about 14 thousandths of an inch thick, which is a bit on the thick side. I wouldn't get slats any thicker than these. Something like 8 thousandths of an inch is probably more appropriate. And that's what you can find at, I know LMI sells metal slats, blue spring steel, 8 thousandths of an inch thick. And those probably work great. I've never used them. But I know that having thinner slats like that is more ideal. The problem with very thick slats is that when you go to remove the side after it's been bent to shape, so imagine the side is already bent like this, and it's sandwiched between these two slats. Now the slat on top is going to bend back to its flat shape, no problem, because there's nothing wedging it in that's going to prevent it from doing that. But the one on the bottom, as it tries to flex back to shape as you're removing this, it's going to put some serious pressure on the sides. So keep that in mind, because the thinner these slats are, the less pressure it puts on the sides as you're removing it. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. You'll see later when we actually perform the bending process. You'll see later how I use springs to hold the bottom slat down during removal. You could also do something like that, or you could just use thinner slats, like 0.8 of an inch. So the sandwich starts with our metal slat on top, then the heating blanket, then your side, and then the other metal slat on bottom. And there you have your sandwich. Now, if you were to just put your side in like this, like I've shown, you would probably have some scorching from the thermal blanket. Not to mention the moisture that we're going to add to the side will likely burn off and escape pretty quickly. And the moisture is what helps keep the side pliable for bending. So to protect the side and to lock in the moisture, most builders will use either parchment paper or aluminum foil. I actually like to use both. First, I'll wrap it in the parchment paper, followed by the aluminum foil. And the last thing we need is some clamps. Now, you don't need this many clamps. This is actually the box I use to hold my kerfing clamps. So these are all the various clamps that I use to glue kerfing. And any of these will work well for our purposes here. All we need is small clamps with a light hold, just to hold our sandwich together while it's heating up before we start the bending process. The only clamps here that I wouldn't use are some of these plastic ones, because they're going to melt from the heat. These would work fine. I would probably just take the rubber bands off, because the rubber bands will probably fall apart from the heat as well. But generally I like to use these little metal ones. I think you can find these at luthier suppliers. I think Stuart McDonald has them labeled as kerfing clamps, but I like to use them for this purpose. And that's it. So in the next class, I'm going to show you how I take this side and turn it into this using a side bending machine. If you learned something here, please give this video a like and subscribe so you can be notified when I release a new DIY guitar making video every Friday. And if you want to really learn more, take one of my structured online courses at ericschaferguitars.com, or register for a hands-on guitar building workshop here with me in Burnville, Pennsylvania.